There's a lot of times where simple multiple choice or short answer or matching won't do the trick because you have a complex, higher level learning goal. And then this is the key thing, you want to see how the students have organized the ideas and concepts in their heads. That's the only reason why you would use an essay or a rubric, when you're trying to get them to demonstrate that they have organized things. And that's really important in a lot of areas. Writing in particular, but in science, social studies, and even math in some occasions. We're going to talk about really two major ideas. One is creating essays and the prompts that get students to respond, and then also creating the rubrics that allow you to score and can, in some cases, give students guidelines for what you're looking for and what the different levels of success look like. So, starting with essay creation, we can think of essays in two ways, or in two forms, as restricted or extended. Now, restricted essays are shorter. They're targeting much more structured ideas. They're relatively easy to grade, and they're really better at assessing the amount of knowledge or the quantity of knowledge that students have. I want them to list some things, but in sentence form. I want them to describe a limited number of characteristics. I want them to put some things in their own words or demonstrate that they understand the relationship between two ideas. But typically, it is really just, I'm trying not to give them any cues, and I want to see if they at least have some basic structures in their head. So, for example, describe two situations that demonstrate the law of supply and demand. Do not use examples discussed in class. Explain how the different relationships in an ecosystem create a dependency between different populations. State your reason in one sentence and give two concrete examples, each in one sentence. Describe one benefit and one limitation of using multiple choice items that we discussed in class. Or explain why validity is the most important measurement concept in no more than 3 sentences. Here I'm giving very specific demonstrations. A lot of these could be answered in one sentence. You don't really need 3. But I know that some people like to write and explain their ideas. But you do want to put that upper bound. Now, the key here is, I'm giving them typically a direction to tell me about a single idea, maybe 2, and how they're related. But I'm providing some of the structure, which is why it's a restricted essay. When we think of extended essays, it gives you a much better representation of how things exist if you weren't in the room and what the student would likely be able to do all on their own in a real-world situation. You give fewer cues, you give more freedom in response, and it really lets you see the connections that exist between ideas in a student's mind. We think about this as a better way to measure the quality of knowledge and integration of ideas. And because we're targeting such a complex and kind of complicated thing, the costs are a lot more in terms of the time it'll take them to take it and the time it'll take you to grade it. Some examples might be that you've come across before. Discuss the changes that followed No Child Left Behind in public school classrooms and administrative offices, and argue from a position of whether there is an overall improvement or degradation of educational quality. Second, discuss how life changed for the people in the Confederate States after the Civil War ended. Discuss the economy, education, and continuing tensions. Both of these cover broad concepts and would likely be several paragraphs long. In this case, I would probably want my students to follow general essay format where they tell me what they're going to say. They say it in 1 to 3 paragraphs, and they summarize it at the end. Likewise, I'd want them to do something similar here. Maybe they could limit this to 1 paragraph, but that paragraph would probably be at least 6 sentences long. Might be better off discussing each one of these topics in its own paragraph, right? These are things that I would probably train my students of what I'm looking for prior to assigning these things as essays. Otherwise, they'll have all sorts of problems. I might add additional guidelines to these, like for this one. I might say, address each of these different ideas in one paragraph each, providing at least 2 examples that we have covered in class. Something like that. That will give me better reliability, but then I am giving students some structure. We can think of it as though we were talking about validity in this class. And, I could ask you about validity in a variety of ways. I could ask you in a restricted sense, right? Describe the 3 major types of validity, right? In the space below, 1 sentence each. And I want you to talk about content, construct, and criterion, because those are the 3 that we covered. An extended essay, I might make it a little more complicated, but a little looser by just saying, describe the types of validity that we've discussed in class, explaining the importance of each and why teachers need to know about each type of validity to operate effectively in their classrooms. Right? Much more complicated. You have to justify your positions. You have to relate it to your actual practice as a teacher. So there's a lot more that goes into it. The great thing about the extended essay is you really do get to know a lot more about what your students are thinking. However, it does take a lot of time, which is why if you think back to those classes that you took in your freshman year where there were 100 or so people or 200 people in a class, right? They weren't assigning essays in those. You weren't writing papers for those classes. Now, in some cases, if they have enough TAs, you can. But for one professor to have to grade 200 students, 5 to 10 page papers, that's asking a little too much. I just don't have the time. Now, when we think about different supply type options, we have our objective items, interpretive exercises, and short answer, where I basically want them to list or describe or explain or identify something very short. And again, the response is in a word or a phrase at the most. We have our restricted essays, right, where I want them to do things like explain some things, describe some things, formulate, generate, state, and so on. Different types of relationships over here, right? And so if I'm talking about cause and effect relationships, whether it's in ecosystems or I'm talking about Spanish colonization or the Civil War, right? Short answer items will have me identify different causes, different effects, right? Restricted essays will be targeted more at having them explain how those things are related and why a cause resulted in the effect that it did. When we go to the extended essays, now I need them to identify or generate their own causes that we maybe didn't talk about, but I kind of set them up too if they can think hard about it. They need to organize and they need to express those ideas towards some kind of end, right? And this is really purposeful writing to do something. So in this case, for cause and effect relationships, I might want them to explain how the situations that existed in the, say, economic policies in the U.S. ultimately led to the Civil War. I might, if I'm thinking about Spanish colonization, I might ask them to think about what Europe was like prior to the Columbian Exchange and why everyone in Europe all of a sudden went colony crazy towards the quote-unquote New World. Right? Again, this is something in an extended essay where they would have to generate their argument, they'd have to organize their ideas, and then express them effectively. We can think about this in terms of applications of principles, right? So we're talking about that science material and the different types of ecosystems that exist in there. I might want them to apply the principles of symbiotic relationships to their daily life. If I'm giving them a short answer or interpretive exercise, I will give them a scenario and they have to identify the type. If I'm giving them a restricted essay, I might want them to generate their own idea and describe why it's a parasitic relationship. If I'm going with an extended essay, I might ask them to describe how these different relationships provide an equilibrium within an ecosystem, right? All the three different types of symbiotic relationships, and maybe having them integrate it with adaptation and competition, maybe, right? It gets more complicated, and I will be expecting broader results from them. Now, when we think of essays and what we want them to do, I typically don't want them to list facts. I typically don't want them to even just describe an idea. I want them to do something a little more active, comparing, relating again, or explaining why, justifying, summarizing. This is a good laundry list for some different general ideas that you can use when thinking about when is it appropriate for me to use an essay. If you're having them write an essay to just recall a bunch of facts, that's a big old waste of everybody's time. Now, in one sense, you could say, I do want to know if they know the facts, right? And say that you want them to retell the story of Spanish colonization. And you've gone over maybe a dozen different major events that happened and so on. And you've had the diagram on the board, you gave them the study notes and so on. And then you just want them to rewrite that whole thing. You could do it that way, but that will take the students a really long time to write all that out, and that'll take you a really long time to grade it, especially if it is just a free paragraph format. It would be a nightmare. You would never do it again, in other words. Instead, if I'm just having them recall a bunch of facts, I can provide concept map structures. I can provide lists that they can choose from. I can do a whole bunch of other things where they can draw relational arrows and things like that. That will take me a little bit longer to make, but I will save a ton of time in grading, and it won't take my students as long to produce the artifacts. So these are some ideas of what you might be looking for. And I'd like you, to apply these ideas shortly, but this will be part of the assignment where I will want you to think about what goals might be appropriate for different types of essays and what would that essay look like. But more on that later. Now, the pros and cons of essays, we've already talked about these indirectly. But the pros, right? You measure skills and knowledge that you can't really measure that easily in other ways, where I'm trying to get at higher level learning. And I want to make sure that all those deep structures are actually in my students' heads and they can pull them out of their heads, right? Whereas application and below, I tell them exactly what I want them to do and then they do it. With essays, and where essays are really useful, is getting at that higher level skill where I want them to produce or reproduce that deep structure for me, so I know that they have it in their head, and that's the framework that they're seeing the world in. Second, emphasis on integration and application for problem solving. If I'm using essays well, I am forcing my students to integrate ideas as they answer those questions, right? And one of the great things about this is that it promotes student learning and critical thinking. Another pro down here, it's related to this, because I am forcing them to hold different concepts in their working memory and start making connection. In some cases, it's a synthesis or a creative act in the Bloom's taxonomy sense. It also helps me evaluate writing skills, which may or may not be part of my learning goals. Now, one of the things we'll talk about is that writing skills might be something that you're targeting in every class that you teach, not just language arts, because it's so important. And we think that the ability to write clearly develops the ability to think clearly, and it does. They are very similar in how students are assessed on them and what they reflect in terms of how the student's mind thinks, how your mind thinks. If you have clearly defined learning goals, your essays will be pretty easy to make. And there's a really small guessing factor, but there's a kind of a big BS factor that kind of gets us to the cons. Unreliable scoring. Sometimes it's hard to tell what a student really knows based on some rambling response where they may actually be expressing everything perfectly, but it's an example you've never heard of. It's a perspective you've never considered. And so you might dock them a bit because you just don't understand what they're trying to say. Whereas in a conversation, it might become clear and you might find common ground. You also have all the inter-rater, where students don't understand the criteria, and the intra-rater, where you have biases and get tired and burnt out and so on. The biggest one, though, is the time and scoring. And I say the biggest one in the sense from a practical perspective, meaning that you will get tired after a while. If you haven't done this, I don't want to ruin the surprise too much, but it can be a test of your will to do it fairly and to do it well. It's fun at first, but then it gets less fun. Okay, finally, we have the limited amount of material that is addressed. So, in other words, if I use essays all by themselves, I know a lot of professors, and I'm sure you had some teachers that just assess using essays all the time. That can be good, but it typically limits the amount of information that you get access to. In other words, I can spend a whole bunch of time asking my students to just do some really high-level thinking about all the content we've covered, but I will likely not get coverage of all my learning goals. Otherwise, it would be an unbelievably large assessment that is not appropriate for any class. So you have to be careful with how you think about your coverage. And my recommendation is that you should only use essays when you can't use anything else, and reserve all the major writing for those lesson goals or those unit goals that represent higher levels of thinking.